everybody. So finally, I'm finally done. I'm finally ready to show you what I found. So as a reminder, I am doing this for all of us who were born outside of the island, for all of us who were raised outside of the island, because some of us were born in the Dominican, but then were raised in other places. And I'm doing this so that we can get a better understanding of who we really are as a people, as Dominicans, what our history is, our background is. Because especially for us growing up in the U.S., we hear a lot about the American history, right? We hear about blacks and whites and Indians, etc. But we actually aren't a part of that. We have our own history. So in this episode, I want to introduce you to los Taínos. And not just the Taínos. I want you to also get to know a little bit about the other cultures that lived on the island. So this episode is only about them. I'm not going to mention anything that happened with anyone else because I'm tired of hearing it. I'm tired of hearing that él hizo esto, fulano, whatever, mingano. But we never really hear about them, about the indigenous people who lived on the island. We only hear about what was done to them, but not what they already had accomplished. So let's go back in time. It's December 4th, 1492. And the moon is rising. This is your view of your island home, of where you've always been, of where your ancestors have always been for hundreds of years. What you don't know is that outside of your island is this. The world is a lot bigger than what your little island lets you see. So to give us a better understanding of the times that were currently being evolved, was currently being lived in, we have to stop for a moment and look at the world's political view. So at the times, these are our other rulers outside of the island. We have Holy Roman Emperor all the way at the top, Frederick III. I'm going to just touch on the ones that people know the most. So we know Castile, Queen Isabella I. We know Aragon, Fernando II. A lot of people know Denmark and Norway. We have King Hans I, the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Babecid II. Portugal, we know Juan II. And then we have France, King Charles VIII. England, we have King Henry VII. And then below that, we have here Scotland, King James IV. So King Henry is Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. So this is just to give us a better understanding of the time period, of where we are currently looking at. And I wanted to present this because I feel it's important. I've had some conversations with people who have no idea of when in time these things happen. So I hope this gives some of you at least a sort of timeline or time frame to put the Taínos in. So let's talk about the island. Quisqueya was the original name, the name before the Taínos were even on here. But later on, they did name the entire island Haití. So Quisqueya means Gran Tierra Madre, or Great Mother Earth. And we know this because Andrés Morales was sent by the then governor, Fray Nicolás de Ovando, to do an expedition to get to know the island better. So he wrote the following. Well, Pedro Martí wrote the following, because Pedro Martí de Angleria, he was like a big gossip. He loved everything about the New World, and he picked up everything. He heard about what Andres Morales did, and he wrote what Andres Morales found in his expedition. So in his book, Décadas del Nuevo Mundo, libro 7, década 3, he wrote, los nombres que los primitivos habitantes pusieron a la española fueron primero Quisqueya y luego Haití. Tales denominaciones no fueron hijas del capricho, sino de la significación que según ellos tenían. Llaman en efecto Quisqueya a una cosa grande y que no tiene igual. Because in actuality, Quisqueya, they read it backwards. Well, they didn't read, but the way the meaning was basically backwards for us. So, I at the end means mother, que means tierra, and quis means big. So that's why we know it means gran tierra madre. He continued writing and said, a dicha palabra le dan el significado de vastidad, or vastness, greatness, universo. We also have a map from 1631 made by Gerardo Mercator y Jodocus Andies. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Again, from 1631, where they include both names. They include Quisqueya y Haití. So the Taino culture was very complex. And this is the thing about that term. The term Taino doesn't show up anywhere. Except in what Columbus wrote as his encounters with them. He said that they would say Taino, Taino. Okay. However, ni Bartolomé de las Casas, ni Oviedo, all the bigger people who wrote about them that I consulted and I read, nobody mentions Taino. However, as of now, this is the term with which they are known, and this is the term which I will be using for them. So Taino is the term that is used to describe the indigenous people of the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Jamaica. However, this was an umbrella term for a mixed nation of people of different indigenous ethnicities. Según Bartolomé de las Casas, we have several ethnicities. Los Macorices, los Iguayos, los Ibonés. They mentioned the Caribs. However, the Caribs were actually invaders of the island. They were invading on this side. They did not actually live on the island. They were from the Lesser Antilles, which are the islands that are down this way, while in the Upper Antilles, we have los Taínos mostly. So these ethnicities lived under the Taino political setup. However, they had their own cultures, they had their own language, and so there were minimum 3 languages on the island. But the Taino language was the main one that everybody understood. So for example, here in the US, there's tons of languages, but everybody, give or take, should know English. So let's talk a little bit about some of these ethnicities. So if you see on the map, there's many different ethnicities that were located in the region of the soon-to-be Spanish colonies. And one of them was los Macorices. So we have San Pedro de Macorís, San Francisco de Macorís still on the island. And the term Macorís actually means those who are not from here. In other words, the foreigners. So they lived closer to the northeastern upper side of the island. They had their own language, which Ramon Pané, he only knew their language. And so when he was sent out to live with the Taínos, he was like, I don't know how to speak their language. And he was told, well, you better learn. We also have the Siboneyes, who were also in Cuba, and they lived mostly in caves. They didn't cultivate the land. They simply collected what they could. They also lived in Jaragua. here. So episode 5, part 2. So continuing from the last part, the Cibones lived on our island in what we came to know as Jaragua, which is in this area, which is now part of Haiti. The Ciguayos were another ethnic group because, as I said in the previous video, the Taínos were actually composed of many ethnic groups. And one of the research papers I read by Jorge Esteves, he did a research paper talking about the origin of the name Taino, and the conclusion is that we can use the term, it is okay. However, it isn't what they were actually called. They recognized that they were all from different cultural backgrounds, or again, ethnicities, and they identified in different ways. However, we don't know what they were called collectively on their own terms. We only have what others have said. So for now, we're going to continue identifying some of the ethnicities under the Taino kingdom. Or better said, political structure, because it wasn't actually kingdoms. So the last group I'm going to share with you are the Ciguayos. So the Ciguayos actually lived in the kingdom of Guagua, which is this in the blue right here. They dominated that area, and they were best known as being fearsome warriors. Both men and women were skillful and very trained at using bows and arrows, and this was something renowned on the island. So their name, from what Pedro Martí de Angleria says, he says that they were at the foot of the mountains named Ciguayos. So they lived mainly up top in the mountains in that area. From what's known about them, they originally were nomads and they didn't cultivate the earth, but they lived also in caves. They were known for being very tall, much taller than the other Taínos on the island, and they were known for having a beautiful physique, or physically. They were very handsome. They occupied the whole eastern side of the island, including La Península de Samaná. Las Casas gives a little bit of a different reason why they were named Ciguayos. He says that it's because they had very long hair. Very similar to how Spanish women carried their hair, which was very long down their backs. So los Samaníes, this is a representation of one of them, again, were one of the greatest warriors on the island. So being on the peninsula of Samaná, they made it their function to protect the island from the invasion of the Caribs. The Caribs had an interesting way of fighting. So what they would do would be that they would come on both sides of the peninsula, because the peninsula, as you know, is basically a bit of land that has water on 3 sides, but not the 4th side. So they would come around both sides of the peninsula, and whatever was in the middle, that's what they would attack. So the Samaníes, Ciguayo warriors, took their job, their function so seriously to such an extreme that this is what they ended up doing. They ended up walking backwards. So they would walk backwards in order to be able to constantly look at the sea, since that's where the Caribs would invade from. And it's from the Ciguayos that we get the legend of La Ciguapa. So as many of you probably have heard of the myth of La Ciguapa, which is a woman who, with very long hair, but has her feet backwards. So when men would encounter her, they would obviously be spooked because she would come out at night and it was obvious she wasn't human. But as they ran, they would see that her feet were supposedly going away from them, when in actuality, because they're on backwards, she was walking towards them. The Ciguayos were directed by women. Their society was matriarchal, and the women were also known as great warriors, as medicine women. So what did they look like physically? So we know that the Ciguayos had long hair. That was one of their traits, one of their identifying traits. And we know that for example, the Macorise wore their hair short, just like the main Taino culture did as well. Both men and women wore their hair short, but the women wore it right above the shoulder. By all accounts, they were about this skin tone, not very dark, not very light or brown. However, we also know that a certain group of them, especially from where Anacaona was from, were lighter toned. We have several accounts where the Spanish were amazed at how light they were. The same as the men. The men were also very light-skinned. So let's continue learning about the daily life of the Taino people in general, because again, each ethnicity had their own cultures, their own languages. However, we do have an idea of what their daily lives were like. So now it's December 5th, 1492. Daybreaking. In Taino, el amanecer or daybreak is Mautia. Soon you can see Ture, the sky, Bara, the sea, and Ni, the water. You're on Que, tierra, or earth. And something interesting about Ture, which is where the indigenous people supposedly, take it with a grain of salt, said that Columbus came from. It would make sense if you see this right here. To them, anything that came from this line had to seem like it was coming from Ture, from heaven. I mean, look at that. If you're seeing it from far away, it's not going to be coming from the ocean. It's going to be coming from above. At least that would be like the logical conclusion if you're on an island. One of the problems with living on a beautiful island is that sometimes we have hurricanes. El huracán is a Taino word. Hu means wind, Hri means energy, and Kan means center. So basically, kind of like saying wind with center energy. Makes sense? Because this is what it looks like from space. And it's amazing how the Taínos knew when a hurricane was coming. They learned to look at nature for signs. One of the signs that they would look for were dolphins. Because most of the time, dolphins are not near the coast. They're out at sea. When they would see the dolphins come to the coast, they knew a hurricane was coming. So let's say that today was a beautiful day. Un tiempo despejado. It's a clear sky. So it's marou in Taino. And on a day like this, many of the women would be heavily pregnant, ready to give birth. Most of the Taino women gave birth in rivers, and they were attended to by other women who helped them in the process. If there wasn't a river nearby, they would use a sort of basket, not an actual basket, but una vasija, big enough so in order for the child to go into the water right after birth. Water births are still practiced in many indigenous areas. Obviously, in our area, it isn't because we have lost that practice. But this is what it might have looked like for a mother to have given birth to her baby in the water and be able to cradle it right after giving birth. It was said that the mom would recover rather quickly from the birth, and the entire community would help in the raising of the baby. According to Ramon Pané, the children, once they learn how to speak, would ask for their mother's breast, and they would call it toa, toa. We don't know if they did any other celebrations for the births, but we know that it was probably a very special occasion. So, episode 5, part 3. So the baby has just been born, and tu Chichi, which is another Taino word, is growing. Once children were able to help around the village, they were given different tasks. For example, they were tasked with keeping the birds away from the fields that were full of different produce. So some of the produce that the children would be defending would be ají, batatas. It was said that the batatas of Jaragua were the best. They would eat them raw. They would also eat them asada, or basically on the grill, and also cocidas. El cariaco is un tipo de maíz, so it's a type of corn that was native to la isla de la Española. El ají guagua, super picante, but the indigenous people enjoyed it. So using this type of corn, after a baby was taken off the breast, they were prepared a special drink based on this type of corn. Normally, it would be in grilled or asado. They would also eat it raw. But for the toddlers, they would use the corn before it was completely ripe, and they would grate it and make it very nicely mashed into a type of milk. With this grated corn, or maíz, as it was called in Taino, they would then develop joba, which was the name of the milk that they would then feed to their toddlers. It was an essential nutrient or food for their children, and boys and girls enjoyed it. To this day, they still make a type of arepita, so a type of, I'm going to say tortilla, even though it's not exactly, are called guanimo. So the term barbacoa, or barbecue, a lot of people know that it is an indigenous word. It is a Taino word. And originally, this is what it was like. So very similar to how we use a grill nowadays. But later on, the term barbacoa was used as like a storage place. Even my own mother, she remembers being a child and being told, oh, llévate esto a la barbacoa, take this to the barbacoa, which was mostly like a type of shed that was used to store food. So as the young indigenous Taínos grew, they learned how to swim. And swimming was super important. Everybody knew how to swim. And it was something that was very impressive. Even when the Spanish came over, they kidnapped many of the young indigenous people. And in one occasion, one of them, well, it was a group of women, they took them. And the group of women, through signs, had them like turn around. And once they were close enough to Borique or to Puerto Rico, they jumped off the ship and swam. So we know that the teenagers were very good swimmers. They were adept at this because this was part of their culture. However, of the people that I looked through, that I read, none of them absorbed any rites of passage. We know that many cultures, even nowadays, when a girl turns 15, le tiran una quinceañera. We don't have any record that they ever did anything like this. And some say that it's because their culture was destroyed so quickly. However, the big massacre that happened with the Taínos, caciques and cacicas, and caciques was the term that they used for their chiefs. This didn't happen until almost 10 years later. And during that time, Fray Ramon Pané had lived among them for several years. And so I'm going to give my opinion. I'm going to give my opinion on this. I feel that they probably didn't have anything like that. Only because, and this is the only reason I think this, is because I've lived among other cultures before. I lived in Guatemala for a while. And I was able to observe so many of their traditions and cultures just by being there for a couple of months. So if this person is there, I'm thinking about them, the Taínos who were so connected to their environment. You're gonna tell me you're not gonna see nothing? So I honestly think that they probably didn't have anything like that, because we know that they had so many different other customs. Why would the rites of passage not be noted? So besides that, we know that they valued certain skills that we value today. For example, the development of creative skills. So we know that if they saw that a young one had a great ability of storytelling or song, they were encouraged to develop those talents, and they would lead, for example, areito ceremonies, and I'll explain later what areitos are, but they were very important to them. And basically you were a superstar if you sang at an areito. Or better said, if you had the lead, because everybody sang, but if you had the lead. So if a girl was adept at healing and herbs, she could maybe be a priestess of one of the gods. If the boy could, again, swim like a fish, hunt skillfully, he was great at building bohíos, or their homes. That was the name that was used to describe their homes. Or archery. Girls also practice archery. They would then be trained by an older person in the village more seriously to help them develop those skills. So now let's say that you're a young girl. You've grown up and they've noticed that you have a certain skill in pottery making. So women were the only ones in the tribes, or in, I'm going to say clan, that were allowed to make pottery. So everything you see in terms of Taino art in pottery is the reflection of feminine artistic expression. And as you see here, all of these are women. They're all doing different parts of the pottery process. They're making different types of pottery used for cooking, used for transporting water, and this was a daily task. They also made baskets, and they also prepared food, in particular, el casabe. So the area where they cooked was called el can. Nowadays, un can is where we go to party, una chercha, un relajo. Pero en el tiempo de los Taínos, el can, which means circular, was where they would cook. En otra palabra, el can era la cocina. So, la yucubia, which is la yuca plant. So this is what it looks like underneath the plant. And in the markets, we usually see it like this, o pelada. So they would transport the yuca en una batea. This is what it kind of looks like. And it was called una managui. So I'm using all of the Taínos words possible. So even batea, that many know that we use in DR, is a Taino word. And the batea they used was actually made of Guagua. My dad talks about how he would do this when he was little. Una hoja de Guagua se metía adentro y pa' abajo, just like sledding on the snow. And just so you know, a Guagua is basically a piece of palm leaf that is huge. It is very big. All of us who have cleaned off the skin of the yuca know it's very hard. They use this, una caguara, to do that. But maybe you misplaced it. So instead of that, you would use levisa, which was the skin of a fish, para raspar, or to take off the skin of the yuca. So now clean, it was time to grate it, and you would use un guayo. So el guayo y el guariquitén, where the grated yuca would be placed. It was then placed in a cibucan, where all the juices of the yuca would be squeezed out. So la masa de yuca, called cativia, was then pushed through a sieve, which is this right here, called ajibe. It was cooked over this clay plate called a buren. So episode 5, part 4. So After la masa de yuca called cativilla was then placed on the bourén, the clay plate that was placed over the fire, in order to cook it on the other side, they used a wooden spatula called a cuisa in order to flip it. Las Casas tells us that the women could produce, between 5 to 6 women could produce up to 1,700 pounds of cassave a day. This amount would feed up to 1,000 people, and el cassave became the bread of the entire island, even during the conquest. But it is to note that the yuca that the Taínos used at the time is not the yuca that we use today. The one that we use today was actually brought over from Central America and is known as sweet yuca, yuca dulce, because the ones that the Taínos used was actually very bitter and it was very, very toxic. They figured out how to take out the poison from the yuca, and with that poison they did other things that I'll talk about later. They didn't let anything go to waste though. With this same masa or cativilla, they would make a fermented drink named huicu, so it would get them nice and out of their minds. Another dish that they made was el ajiaco, which was a stew. Unlike these, which many other countries also have stews with a similar name or with the same name. In the Taino version, they put in meat, fish, cassave, y mucho ají. El ají was their main spice. They put it in everything. Some of the other items that they gathered was el ananá, la piña. There is said that there were several varieties of this. Some were sweeter and some were obviously less sweet. Pero la piña became the symbol of wealth in almost every part of the colonies, including the English colonies. And that's why in many ports, one of the symbols that you'll see is this, meaning that the ship came back, it came with everything that it wanted to come with, and the sailors plus the captain and the investors became rich. El maní, el cajuil, or the cashew as we know it in the States, el caimito. The tree of this fruit was used for construction. El pan de chola, which is made with a root product called guayiga. If your last name is Guagua, this is where it comes from. And it's also a Taino word. Guagui, la malanga, la guanábana. Today it is used as a cancer-fighting fruit. La guayaba. The Taínos believed that the spirits of the dead would come out at night to eat guayabas. The famous guava berry comes from a tree that in Taino is called guayabacan. Some people use yautía and malanga interchangeably, but for the Taínos, yautía was this. It was something different than the malanga. So obviously there were many more fruits and vegetables that they produced. However, we have lost the names of all of them. And with the conquest, their way of diet was replaced by a European-based diet. However, one thing stayed the same: el cassave. Cassave making was passed down generation to generation, and that's why to this day we still eat it. So now we've seen most of what women did. They also, like I said, they did various other things. They made belts, they made a lot of different items. So what did the men do? So the men had several chores, but one of their main chores was building houses, preparing the land for sowing, for harvest. They also hunted, they fished, they took care of fish farms as well, where they had several different types of fish that they kept alive and reproduced so that they would never run out of food. And they also did this. They were artists at carving images. They would make objects out of wood and stone with such detail that nowadays we literally need a magnifying glass to see all the detail in these works. This is an example of one of them. It's one of their musical instruments called a fotuto. Some specialists think it's actually hotuto because the F wasn't actually used as much in the Taino language. But look at this detail. This is amazing. And they carved this in. They carved it in. Just think about that. This is a funerary urn. And look at this. The detail here. This is, hey, look at the top. The crown. That's amazing. This is one of their necklaces that they made. This is out of bone. And look at how each piece has a design on it. This is meticulous. It would have taken probably days to complete such a work. Here's a better example of the fotuto. Look at this. This is a different one. And you can see so much detail. It's just amazing. So I've noticed a big difference between the women's work and the men's work. The men have a lot more faces, a lot of, I don't know if this is grinning, like the teeth. We see a lot of that in the men's work. While in the women's work, we see a lot of forms, a lot of geometry, a lot of animals. This is another pretty example, una vasija. This one I love. Look at that. Es un sapo. Es un sapo. Mira el detalle del sapo. These are body stamps. So the body stamps were made from arcilla or clay. So the women were the ones who made them. And I'm not sure what they are, but I'm guessing I think this is another, una rana. Maybe this is another one. I'm not sure what that is. But whatever you think it is, guess and let me know in the comments what you think it is. But one of the main things that the men would do was build canoes. Y la canoa is actually the first indigenous word, Taino word, included in the Spanish language. And because there's no other way to describe the vessels that they made, which were perfect for navigating between island and island, canoa is actually included in all languages nowadays. And you can see here they made smaller ones, they made bigger ones. It is said that some of the largest canoes could hold up to 70 people. So some of the sails will actually be made of algodón, cotton, sarobe in Taino. They would even use palm leaves for the sails of their canoes. They would use la gigante ceiba in order to make the canoes out of the trunks. El guayacán, which I mentioned in the last video, was also used as the tree source for the canoes. The guayacán is where we get the guava berry from. The canoas were so fast that even the galleys, which were the Spanish ships that were their fastest ships, could not keep up with one canoe. So one of the writers of the time called Oviedo, he explained how they made the canoes. And here's an example step by step. But on page 160, it explains really well here. It says, Oviedo later explained the canoe was made from the trunk of a tree that was emptied by blows of stone axes, which are these. And he says, and they go burning what is beaten little by little. We can see that happening in the top one. They put in benches once it was cleared. The Taino paddle, which is what they used to row with, called nai. So episode 5, part 5. I'm not sure how many parts this episode is going to be. I'm just going to go with it. When it ends, it ends. But as a reminder, I'm doing this because I know that most of us born outside of the island have a really big disconnect with our history and our people, and I'm doing this because I need it too. And I know that it will help us better understand who we are as a people. So in part 4, I ended with the canoe making process, which was extensive. We know that they probably had a ceremony for selecting the tree, processing the tree, and at the end, launching the canoe. But unfortunately, it is believed that all of those rituals were lost, and we will never know if they even had any. Christopher Columbus, Colon himself was so impressed by these vessels that this is what he wrote. He said, "They go in a manner you would not believe, and they sail all the islands, which are innumerable, and bring their merchandise." In other words, they had trade routes. They had commerce, maybe not, obviously not in the same way that we do commerce, but they did have it. Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a huge defender of indigenous rights, he wrote that they did daily commerce between La Española or La República y Puerto Rico. We now know that some of the caciques, who were the leaders, the names of the chiefs or the title of the chiefs, some of them were related to each other. The ones from La Española or La República y Haití, and the ones from Puerto Rico. For example, on page 162 of this book, it says that el cacique Andrés del Higüey de la Española was considered a relative of the cacique of Aguabana of Puerto Rico. As we see, they also used their canoes to fish. They used nets, they used harpoons, they used different methods in order to catch the fish. They used hooks made of bone. They even would knock out the fish with a narcotic plant named Guagua. And this would, make the fish sleepy and make it easier to catch. So canoes came, like we said, in various sizes. And Columbus reported the largest one. Like, in general, they could hold about 70 people. However, Columbus said that he saw a beautiful canoe, because they also painted them. And this was in Cuba, that was reportedly 65 feet long and had a capacity of about 150 people. Basically, kind of like an airplane, no? So we know through this that when young boys were shown to have a good ability for swimming, for canoe making, for navigating canoes, they would learn how to navigate by the stars. However, it wasn't as deep as, for example, the Spanish. The Spanish knew a lot more about astrology and how the movement of the moon and the stars worked, and they used it against indigenous people, and I'll tell you about that later on. However, their ability to just navigate between island and island, literally, when Columbus came around, he went from island to island, and he would find in between the islands people just in canoes, just chilling. We're just there. So kind of like this. They were very comfortable with just chilling by themselves in the middle of the sea, just having the time of their lives. So what else would a young boy learn how to make? Hamacas. The Spanish were amazed by these. They thought these would be great for going to war, because they reasoned you wouldn't have to worry about where to sleep. You just take out your hamaca. And hamaca is the Taino word, and it's used internationally. Usually made out of sarobe or cotton. The Taínos did not sleep on the floor. They slept in these. They kept them cool during the very, very hot nights. But sometimes if it got too cold, they would put some coals or some brasas under la hamaca to keep themselves warm. So let's say you, as a young boy, being silly as you are, you broke something. Del árbol del Guayacán, they would make a type of glue called guaguaco. And it was probably helpful for you to have this glue to help your father make los bollos. Sometimes they would also be called enacra, only in La Española though. So bollo was not only this, it also meant home. It's where you went home to. So sometimes this was bollo, tu casa, home. So I'm going to use this image to help us think about how these things were constructed. So you're a young Taino boy and you're learning from your father how to make un bolillo. So the trees that they would use were normally called corbana. And they used these because they didn't rot easily. Originally, the bolillos would be round. The square ones came after the conquest. So there was usually a main pole in the middle that was taller than everything else. El techo, or the ceiling, the top of it, would be covered by bijao, which was a type of palm. Being la yagua, which I talked about in the other video, sometimes would also be used to cover and also to cover the sides, as we see here. So these parts here that are long, they would be tied con un bejuco, or también una soga that was called ico or jico. Usually or originally the bolillos were very big, they weren't this small. And in each bolillo there was a cautu, which was the fire that burned always inside the bolillo, kind of like this, surrounded by stones. It was never put out. The coals were conserved, so to easily be able to be utilized for anything that they needed in terms of using fire. So while your mom and your sisters are working on pottery or doing herbs or cooking, you might go out con papá or con baba. Even with your baba ma, your grandfather. In another Taino language, as we said, Taínos were a mixed race of different ethnicities. Taino was like the title term for all of them, but they were all different. In another of the languages, abuelo or grandfather was guarocoel. So you get ready to go. You're excited. So you grab your bow, your arrow, and your paira where you put your arrows in. So what is there to hunt? Well, it's not just you and your dad that are off to hunt. Tienes un compañero. El perro arco, or as Las Casas calls it, Ion. Ion. It was a mute dog that they had. The Taínos had them with them. They would hunt with them. They would live with them and be with them. El curi. El curi. We aren't exactly sure if it's exactly this animal, but they did hunt an animal called curi. El Chinchilin. They would hunt this bird by the hundreds, and it stinks. El carey. It was a type of tortoise, and with the shell, they would use it to make different arts. El carrao was another bird that they also hunted. La cigua palmera. Nowadays, it's the national bird of the Dominican Republic. La jicotea, which is a type of freshwater tortoise or turtle. La jaiba. Hay una masita de cangrejo más rica. El maco. El maco, señores. The manatee. How they pulled this off, I don't know. How do you do this? I don't know. And sharks, or el tiburón. They would catch these dudes and make beautiful little necklaces out of their teeth. After a long day's out, you guys head home. Al bohío. There's several generations of your family also getting home. Está babá, Bibi, your mom. Está el Chichi de la casa, tu tío, hermano, hermana, who's still a chimicuí.